4:18 p.m. The Caribbean stretched flat and blinding under a late afternoon sun, the kind of afternoon that makes violence feel impossible. It wasn't. 11 nautical miles off the Venezuelan coast, a contact materialized on the USS Winslow's SPY-1D radar. A single return, accelerating hard, bearing 214. No radio call preceding it, no identification transmitted, just steel mass and closing velocity aimed at a United States Navy destroyer. The captain issued 2 words: hold course. What Venezuela sent that afternoon was not a miscalculation. It was a message, one calculated to pressure, to embarrass, to manufacture a moment of defiance for domestic consumption after a week that had cost Caracas more than it could publicly admit. What Venezuela got instead was 18 minutes of documentation so complete, so methodical, so utterly indifferent to their speed and their silence that the only rational response was to turn around and pretend the whole thing had been a routine patrol. This is how the U.S. Navy handles a gray zone confrontation, and this is exactly how it played out, layer by layer, second by second. The contact's first profile was unremarkable. 12 knots, steady heading, consistent with the coastal patrol traffic that moves through these waters routinely. The CIC watch team tagged it, tracked it, and noted it without alarm. Then, inside 90 seconds, the speed readout changed. 14 knots, 18, 22, 24. Fishing vessels do not accelerate like that. Commercial traffic does not accelerate like that. The profile resolved quickly. Hull length, radar cross-section, mass signature, superstructure geometry, all consistent with a Venezuelan Navy Guaycamacuto-class offshore patrol vessel. Roughly 2,300 tons of displacement, built for coastal enforcement and presence operations, armed with a 76mm OTO Malera main gun and smaller caliber secondary systems. Capable of 22 knots sustained, which meant the speed now registering on the Winslow's plot was beyond standard operating parameters. The Venezuelan captain was pushing his engines. 3 hails went out on bridge-to-bridge radio, the internationally recognized frequency for vessel communications. The first in English, measured and professional. Venezuelan naval vessel. This is a United States warship conducting lawful transit in international waters. You are closing at unsafe speed. Alter your course and acknowledge. The second hail repeated it in Spanish. The third hail followed after a silence that carried its own meaning. No response came back. Not denial, not acknowledgement, not even static. The Venezuelan vessel maintained course and continued to accelerate. On the Winslow's bridge, the captain did not raise his voice. He stepped forward to the plot, assessed the geometry, and confirmed the order he had already given. Maintain course. Log all contacts, all hails, all radar data. Everything gets recorded. Here is what that instruction means in practice, because this is where the sophistication of a modern U.S. Navy destroyer becomes relevant. The SPY-1D passive phased array radar is not a simple detection system. It is a simultaneous tracking architecture that maintains fire control quality tracks on dozens of contacts while feeding data to multiple weapons and sensor systems concurrently. It was already painting the Venezuelan vessel with a precision that the approaching ship's own sensors could not match or detect. Every course adjustment, every speed change, every degree of helm input, all of it was being logged with timestamp accuracy measured in fractions of a second. The SLQ-32V6 electronic warfare suite was operating in parallel. This system characterizes every radar emission in the electromagnetic environment and categorizes it by mode, frequency, pulse width, and pulse repetition interval. When the Venezuelan ship's surface search radar swept the Winslow at 4:20 p.m., the SLQ-32 identified it, logged it, and flagged its mode as surface search rather than fire control. A meaningful distinction. Surface search radar means the approaching vessel was looking. Fire control radar means it was aiming. For now, it was only looking. That word, only, carried significant weight. The watch team noted it. Noted also that the qualifier could change. At 4:22 p.m., the Venezuelan vessel pushed past 26 knots. The closest point of approach calculation, updated continuously by the combat systems, had compressed to under 2 nautical miles on the current geometry. Time to CPA, 6 minutes. The Winslow's response followed the sequence that U.S. Navy training produces instinctively, because in gray zone encounters, the sequence matters as much as the capability behind it. The Mark 45 5-inch main gun trained a few degrees to starboard. Not elevated, not locked onto the approaching vessel, simply repositioned to a visible bearing. In naval communication, the rotation of a main gun requires no radio transmission. It is a posture statement, observed through optics, understood across language barriers, carrying the unmistakable message that the hardware exists and the crew knows how to use it. On the flight deck, the MH-60R Seahawk crew had moved to their aircraft and begun pre-flight checks. The MH-60R is not primarily a weapons platform in an encounter like this. It is a sensor extension and a psychological multiplier. Its MX-20 FLIR electro-optical/infrared turret provides stabilized high-definition imagery at ranges exceeding 5 nautical miles in daylight or darkness, with zoom capability that resolves individual faces at distance. When it lifts off a destroyer's flight deck and proceeds toward an approaching vessel, it communicates several things simultaneously. We have eyes that yours cannot match. Everything you are doing is being recorded in detail, and we can position those eyes anywhere in this airspace without asking your permission. The Venezuelan crew would understand all of that. Naval professionals always do. At 4:26 p.m., the Seahawk launched. It banked left off the deck, descended to 250 feet, and accelerated toward the Venezuelan contact at cruise speed. Sensors active from the moment of liftoff. The FLIR turret acquired the Venezuelan hull within 40 seconds and began building a continuous imagery record. In the cockpit, the pilots kept communications clipped and factual. Winslow, Eagle 1, contact acquired. We have visual, sensors recording. What the FLIR showed relayed to the destroyer's CIC in real time. Venezuelan sailors in combat helmets clustered at the bow near the forward gun mount. The gun itself was not manned, no crew at the breech, no ammunition visible in the loading system, but the sailors were present and positioned in a way that left the option open. This was deliberate staging. The Venezuelan captain was sending his own layered message. We are not firing, but we are ready to fire, and we need you to know that. The U.S. Navy logged the imagery and continued its approach. At 4:28 p.m., with the Seahawk at roughly 1.8 nautical miles from the Venezuelan hull, the sensor operator triggered the laser warning system. A pulse green laser beam crossed the Venezuelan bridge windows, a non-lethal, internationally recognized nautical warning signal used by multiple navies to communicate, "Stop, you are observed, change course." It is not a weapon. It carries no destructive capability. What it carries is clarity, a message that cannot be misinterpreted, delivered at a range and precision that demonstrates the observer's control of the encounter. The reaction on the Venezuelan bridge was immediate and visible through the FLIR optics. Crew members reacted to the beam. One figure stepped back sharply, another raised binoculars toward the Seahawk's position. A third appeared to be in heated communication with someone off-frame. The hull kept moving. But the certainty that had driven the approach began to show its first fractures. The Seahawk crew transmitted again on bridge-to-bridge frequency in Spanish. Venezuelan naval vessel. Your maneuvers are unsafe under international maritime law. Alter your course immediately. You are being recorded. Still no reply. But at 4:30 p.m., the Venezuelan vessel's speed readout dropped. 24 knots, then 22. The approach vector remained, but the commitment behind it had shifted. The EW officer aboard the Winslow read the change correctly. They're reassessing. At 4:32 p.m., the Venezuelan hull turned 2 degrees to port. 2 degrees is not a dramatic course change. It does not make headlines. But in the geometry of a high-speed naval intercept, 2 degrees of divergence at that closing rate was the difference between confrontation and collision avoidance. On the CIC plot, the CPA calculation updated. 2.4 nautical miles widening. The vector that had been aimed at the Winslow's track was now deflecting away from it, slowly but measurably and continuously. The captain gave one instruction. Maintain stance. Hold course. Let them complete the turn. Through the Seahawk's optics, the change in atmosphere aboard the Venezuelan vessel was readable. Sailors who had been clustered at the forward gun position were now dispersed. Arm positions had shifted from the tense readiness geometry of moments earlier to something looser. One crew member, visible clearly on the FLIR feed, raised both hands briefly, a gesture carrying no tactical significance, but carrying considerable human significance. At 4:33 p.m., the Venezuelan bridge transmitted for the first time since the encounter began. The voice was heavily accented, the Spanish formal but not composed. United States naval vessel. We are conducting sovereign patrol duties in this region. We request you adjust your heading. It was not an apology. It was not accurate. The Winslow was in international waters on a lawful transit heading that predated the Venezuelan vessel's departure from port by hours. But it was communication. And communication meant the confrontation had shifted from physical pressure to verbal negotiation, which is an entirely different register of risk. The Winslow's bridge watch officer replied immediately. Venezuelan vessel, we are conducting lawful transit under international maritime law. Your approach has been unsafe and has been fully documented. We will maintain our present course. No further speed surges followed. No additional course cuts toward the destroyer's track. The Venezuelan vessel widened its separation and settled into a parallel track at a respectful distance, still watching, still present, but no longer pressing. By 4:38 p.m., the contact had opened to 6 nautical miles and was effectively shadowing rather than intercepting. By 4:45 p.m., when the Seahawk returned to the Winslow's flight deck, the Venezuelan vessel was 9 nautical miles astern and still opening. By 5 p.m., it had reversed course entirely. The Winslow had not altered her heading by a single degree throughout the encounter. To understand why Venezuela sent that patrol ship, you have to understand what happened 2 weeks earlier. The event Caracas has not publicly acknowledged and has no interest in acknowledging. On September 2nd, 2025, U.S. Southern Command confirmed that 2 Venezuelan-flagged vessels suspected of trafficking synthetic opioids at commercial scale had been neutralized in international waters following multiple warnings and pursuit. Unmanned aerial systems operating in coordination with Navy ISR assets had ended both pursuits with precision and speed. The street value of the cargo those vessels were carrying ran into tens of millions of dollars. The operational embarrassment to Venezuela's naval command structure was not quantifiable in dollar terms. In the days that followed, U.S. intelligence analysts tracking Venezuelan maritime activity noted a systematic change in behavior. Patrol routes became irregular. Offshore presence increased beyond normal operational patterns. Radar emissions from Venezuelan naval assets spiked in frequency. None of this is preparation for warfare. A Venezuelan Gary-class patrol vessel has no realistic offensive capability against an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. The tonnage ratio alone makes the outcome of any genuine exchange a mathematical certainty. What Venezuela needed was not a military victory. It needed footage. It needed the image of a Venezuelan hull closing to uncomfortable range on a U.S. Navy warship. Something that domestic media could present as confrontation, as boldness, as evidence that the Navy was pushing back against American operations in what Caracas frames as its sovereign sphere of influence. The domestic political logic was straightforward. The strategic logic was reckless. Because the U.S. Navy does not produce the footage Venezuela needed. It produces its own footage, higher resolution, time-stamped, geo-referenced, comprehensive, and that footage tells the story accurately. This is what gray zone naval operations actually look like in the 21st century, and why the doctrine behind the Winslow's response is more sophisticated than it appears on the surface. Gray zone maneuvering describes military or paramilitary action calibrated to apply pressure, signal capability, and achieve political effects while remaining below the threshold that triggers a conventional military response. It is the operating space between diplomacy and warfare, exploited by nations that cannot compete at the conventional warfare level but can generate domestic narrative value from aggressive posturing. Venezuela has studied this playbook carefully. The South China Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Black Sea have provided extensive case studies in how smaller navies use proximity, speed, and silence to force larger ones into reactive postures. The U.S. Navy's counter-doctrine rests on 3 principles: documentation, composure, and the credible non-display of overwhelming force. Documentation because in the international legal framework that governs maritime conduct, evidence is power. Footage from the Seahawk's FLIR turret showing a Venezuelan vessel performing unsafe intercept maneuvers, closing to less than 2 nautical miles on a non-responsive course, constitutes the kind of evidentiary record that outlasts the encounter itself. It informs diplomatic communications. It supports future operational decisions. It counters any alternative narrative before that narrative can take hold. Composure because a reactive course change, a defensive posture, any visible sign that the approaching vessel has achieved its psychological objective. All of these represent concessions that cost nothing in steel but considerable amounts in credibility. A destroyer that holds its heading under pressure communicates something that no weapons demonstration can replicate. This crew has done this before. The outcome is not in question, and your approach changes nothing. The non-display of force because the Winslow possessed, at every moment of this encounter, the capability to end it kinetically within seconds. The Mark 45 gun system can engage surface targets at ranges exceeding 10 nautical miles. The ship's magazine contained sufficient ordnance to reduce the Venezuelan vessel to debris multiple times over. None of that capability was displayed, demonstrated, or threatened, because displaying it would have been a tactical error. The restraint is the message. The restraint communicates that the calculus of this encounter is so asymmetric that escalation is not even worth discussing. The Venezuelan captain understood this when the laser crossed his bridge windows and his crew reacted with visible alarm. The U.S. Navy was not startled by his speed. It was not concerned by his silence. It had logged his every maneuver before he completed it. That realization that the entire approach had been observed, characterized, and recorded without producing any of the hesitation it was designed to produce was the moment the encounter ended. The course change followed naturally from that understanding. The intelligence yield from those 18 minutes has a shelf life measured in years, not days. Every radar emission from the Venezuelan vessel was captured, characterized, and added to the electromagnetic profile database that U.S. Navy electronic warfare assets maintain on every potential adversary's equipment. The surface search radar parameters, the communication frequencies used between the Venezuelan bridge and its command ashore, the speed and maneuvering envelope pushed to the limit of the vessel's capability. All of it is now documented and available for analysis. If that hull appears on a radar plot somewhere in the Caribbean 6 months from now, U.S. Navy systems will recognize it faster and more completely than they did at 4:18 p.m. on the day it attempted a high-speed intercept. Venezuela's state media reported a routine sovereignty patrol in the hours that followed. The Winslow's navigation logs recorded 0 course corrections, straight-line transit, constant heading from the first radar contact to the last. Those are not the logs of a vessel that was pressured. Those are the logs of a vessel that was not even inconvenienced. The Caribbean is entering a period where encounters like this will become more frequent, not less. Venezuelan domestic politics have not stabilized. The logic that drove this intercept, manufacture a visible confrontation to offset the political cost of a military embarrassment, is not a logic that resolves itself. It persists as long as the political pressure creating it persists. The U.S. Navy will continue transiting these waters on lawful headings, and Venezuelan commanders will continue facing the choice between restraint that looks like weakness domestically and aggression that produces imagery their opponents control completely. They came looking for a reaction they could use. They found a destroyer that did not blink, a helicopter that documented every second of their approach, and a laser pulse that communicated the entirety of the situation in a single green flash. Some confrontations are decided by firepower. This one was decided by composure, optics, and the cold mathematics of information asymmetry. For Venezuela's naval command, the footage from that FLIR turret is the lesson that requires no translation. If this breakdown gave you something worth sharing, subscribe and pass it along. Drop a comment below with what you want analyzed next. The full electronic warfare suite behind the SLQ-32, the doctrine behind Seahawk deployments in gray zone operations, or another encounter entirely.